Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United States Military Academy and the West Point class of 1951, welcome to the West Point Distinguished Lecture Series. This evening's lecture is one in a series discussing preparing America for the 21st century. This lecture has been made possible by a generous grant from the West Point class of 1951. Colonel Charles Brower, professor and deputy head of the Department of History, will introduce this evening's lecture.
General Galloway, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Corps of Cadets, it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce to you a distinguished American historian, educator, and author. We are truly honored tonight to have with us Professor Barton J. Bernstein, who is Professor of History and the Mellon Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Stanford University. And he'll speak to us tonight on the decision to drop the atomic bomb. In a way, this is a homecoming for Professor Bernstein, who was born in New York City, attended Queens College in New York City. From there, went to Harvard University, where he got a PhD in 1964, and in 1965 went to Stanford and has been there since. He's the author of numerous books on American foreign policy and American political history. He's written widely on the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, and on nuclear deterrence. Of all of the Cold War issues that Professor Bernstein has studied, none is more controversial than his topic tonight. President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan has fascinated historians for really 50 years. And no single historian or observer or thinker about that decision has made a more substantive contribution to our understanding of that fateful decision than has Professor Bernstein. I had the luck of having an opportunity to study with him on this issue 16 years ago. It was at that time we sort of made the plan for him to come and speak to us tonight. And I can tell you that as somebody who is familiar with the literature on this subject, that my standard advice to any cadet or student who's studying it and who's looking for insight, I say, go read Bart Bernstein's work on the decision to drop the bomb. We are truly lucky tonight to have Professor Bernstein guide us through that decision. Please welcome him to West Point.
Thank you. Colonel Brower, thank you very much for an eloquent and lavish introduction. General Galloway, distinguished faculty and guests and cadets, I'm delighted to be here, and I should tell you that actually the first time, other than as a youngster sightseer, that I came to the Academy was when I used to play water polo too long ago, when swimming times were very different from now, and I played for a very bad team. And once a year, we would make the pilgrimage to defeat, as we would come up here and, pun partly intended, we would be literally swamped. I hope tonight that I will at least reclaim from the pools of defeat some of the possibility of triumph by at least discussing something on common ground where we can meet virtually as equals, or ideally, where I know more than you folks, because as a water polo player, I was clearly inept. Okay, I want tonight, and my mandate is, and my desire is to talk about the decision to drop the atomic bomb. And the understanding is that because of other obligations that you have en masse, that I'm allowed, initially I was allowed 40 minutes. I begged, cajoled, coerced, whined, hoped did not bribe. That would have been inappropriate, although I was tempted. And I think I have wrung from the powers that be 42 and a half minutes. Thus, probably at 43 minutes, either I turned into a pumpkin, or you turned into a pumpkin, or we all turned into pumpkins. And thus, I want to begin tonight by framing the issues by reading to you a description after the bombing by somebody looking at the situation and described it this way: corpses scattered or in heaps lay in streets and vacant lots and public shelters, the spaces under railroads. Many were huddled together, apparently for mutual protection. While several bodies showed signs of agony, others just had died. Elsewhere, remains of the dead looked like irregular pieces of charcoal, or consisted only of skeletons, here and there some charred bits of soft tissue and clothing. Some people had turned into ashes that scattered like sand in a light wind. And that probably is as briefly descriptive and as painfully eloquent as any single brief paragraph could be about those momentous events. And I want tonight, almost a half century after the events of 1945, to take you back initially to August 6 and August 9, 1945, when on those two fateful occasions, American planes, B-29s, dropped atomic bombs on Japan. The first time on August 6, a uranium bomb, and killing a minimum of about 80,000, and perhaps as many as twice that number, with concomitant casualties. 3 days later, the Hiroshima bomb killed somewhere between, the low estimate runs now about 40,000, which is undoubtedly too low. The high estimate runs around 60 or 70,000. And thus, on those two occasions, killed somewhere between a minimum of 110, 120,000 and perhaps over 200,000. Killing at Hiroshima, mostly Japanese, but long forgotten, probably more than 10,000 Koreans who were virtually slave laborers in the Japanese Empire. And killing at Hiroshima, unknown to the American public then, somewhere between about a dozen and 24 American POWs. Killing at Nagasaki, about 16 or 18 Allied POWs, not U.S., but rather Dutch. The bombs were used in 1945. The American public enthusiastically endorsed their use. President Harry S. Truman and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson then, and in the next few years, explained why the bombs had been used. They were used, according to this official explanation, because the bombs were necessary to end the war quickly, to save lives, most notably American lives, and thus the decision in the official version was justifiable and easily justified. In 1945, very few Americans raised doubts. Public opinion polls at the time indicated overwhelming support. When doubts emerged, they came disproportionately from leaders of color in America, some clergy people, pacifists, not surprisingly. Within a few years, however, some doubts, a minor streamlet really, of dissent and question began to arise, and not until the 1960s did that streamlet become anything resembling, if I may extend the metaphor, even a river of doubt and dissent. The challenges took this form, that in 1945, the argument ran, the bombs were not necessary. American leaders knew that, or should have known that, Some dissenters argued both, without recognizing the inherent contradiction between knew it or should have known it. Some argued one version of that. And thus, the argument ran, the bombs were used probably or definitely for some other reason. There was a politics of war, and in some formulations, and since many of you have read on this subject, an argument that began in 1948 with a British Nobel laureate in physics, developed very briefly in a book by William Appleman Williams, and more fully in a book by Garl Purvitz. The argument was that the bomb was unnecessary, American leaders knew it, there was an ulterior motive, and it was in some fashion to deal with the Soviets. All the dialogue, until somewhere in the early or mid-70s, focused upon why did Truman do it? Why did Truman decide? And the analysis normally began somewhere in 1945 with Harry S. Truman. And I want tonight to argue what I hope is a more subtle, more carefully architected, more historical, and ideally more compelling analysis. And thus, as you can see by the blackboard, by the way, is the blackboard, I'm sorry, bad question, not is the blackboard visible, is the writing on it legible in the back rows or is it too small? If it's legible in the back rows, if you could just give me a show of hands, that would indicate. Oh, wonderful, okay. This was the case, that means it's visible to about half of you in the last 6 or 8 rows. That's fine. The analysis tonight does not depend upon the blackboard. It's a supplement to those of you who can see it, and I imagine that'll be 85%. I've been offered the alternative of an overhead and the screen. I had decided against that on the grounds that periodically, if I wanted to walk to it, I would disappear virtually off stage, and I thought you should probably have a speaker who remained on stage. I want tonight to begin the analysis not with Harry S. Truman, and not in 1945, but rather with his great predecessor, President Roosevelt, and begin it really in 39 through 45. For the argument, the way I want to cast the matter and begin the analysis and develop it is to understand the decisions of 1945. We should not start there. We should not start with Truman as if there was a blank slate when he became president. But rather we should begin earlier with his predecessor, who made a set of decisions and assumptions that constituted a powerful legacy, inherited, hard to reject, easy to accept, and comfortably in line with Truman's own inclinations. And thus I want to go back to the period 1939 to 1945. Without dwelling unduly upon the role of the scientist, let me say initially only this, that the project to begin the atomic bomb was conceived, ignited, galvanized, and propelled by scientists primarily of emigre background, driven out or having left Europe before Hitler's Leviathan menace, who by 1939 and the discovery of fission the month before in Germany, feared that Germany, with a first-rate science, might proceed to develop the atomic bomb, and with that development might well win the war, shape the peace, and vanquish humane values vested in the minds of the scientists, primarily in the West beyond Germany. Thus, in their mind, it was a necessary quest on behalf of humane values against a barbaric but technically civilized state representing a Leviathan menace, embodying evil beliefs and ideology. That between 1939 and 1941, as some of you know, very little was done to move toward an atomic bomb. There were basic science questions of feasibility, of the amount of raw material needed, of whether this could be accomplished in a few years. By 1941, because of the work done primarily by emigre scientists in Britain, With that information communicated across the Atlantic, American science administrators came to the conclusion the bomb was feasible and could be relatively imminent, that is, within a few years, and thus America would have to embark upon the project, was probably in a deadly race, and what could hang in the balance was Western civilization. That argument was sold to a president, FDR, who could in no way have understood the science, and thus had to at the beginning rely upon the judgment, the integrity, and the honesty of his science administrators. He did, and thus in 1941-42 he made a series of commitments about an enterprise he really could not understand and make in any meaningful sense independent judgment or decisions on, but rather he placed faith in experts. From virtually the beginning, there was a decision and an assumption, and each was to guide American policy through Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The decision was that the bomb, and this was a decision by assumption. It is not that people sat down on one day and debated should they decide, but rather they assumed. And that decision was that the bomb was a legitimate weapon to be used in war against a hated enemy, with the implication being initially the enemy was Germany, the race was for Europe, to the victor would go both spoils and triumph. That was an issue never challenged from the time the bomb was conceived to the time it was used, never challenged by American leaders, although perhaps twice the matter was cast briefly in the subjunctive or in the conditional rather than the simple declarative. Linked to that, and from the beginning, was a decision rather than simply a passive but compelling assumption that the bomb project, as much as possible, should be kept secret. And that meant secret not only from the American people, from whom it was kept secret through Hiroshima, but secret from the enemy, Germany, Japan, for a period, obviously, Italy, and beyond that, secret from a nation which soon technically became an American ally, the Soviet Union. During World War II, while Great Britain was to be a junior partner in the Atomic Alliance and receive some of the secrets developed, and even to send scientists to Los Alamos, and British leaders knew of the American project, there was a systematic, sustained, and elaborate enterprise to bar the Soviet Union from any official knowledge of the project, and ideally from any knowledge of the project. General Leslie Groves, the commanding general of the Manhattan Project, to use a code name, after the war was to say, and I paraphrase, that secrecy during World War II was as much devoted against our sworn enemies, Germany and Japan, as against our putative ally, the Soviet Union. In 1941, in 1942, in 1943, in 1944, in 1945, President Roosevelt repeatedly reaffirmed that decision to maintain secrecy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Thus, from the beginning, he created a system that left open the options for what I'm terming atomic diplomacy. And let me explain what I mean by that. I mean by atomic diplomacy the capacity, once the weapon was developed, to use it for a panoply of possibilities, anywhere from mere possession, constituting a counterweight against Soviet action or inclination, to trading some or many of the secrets involved for Soviet concessions, to, at the extreme form, even using the weapon as a weapon after World War II. Now, I'm not contending that FDR ever intended to use the bomb, had he lived, against the Soviets as a weapon. Nor can we even piece out, in large measure because FDR on so many matters is unfathomable. And on this matter, he left a record of decision, but not of intention, what he would have done with the bomb vis-a-vis the Soviets in the aftermath of war had he lived. But to repeat, what he did is he created a structure of secrecy vis-a-vis the Soviets, which left open a set of options that would be passed on to an heir whom he could not foresee at the time. For like most of us, he believed, if not that mortality was infinite, at least that death was not imminent. On a number of occasions, most notably in 1945, his Secretary of War, the aged Republican statesperson, Henry L. Stimson, approached FDR on the matter of whether secrecy should be maintained or not. And FDR in mid-March 1945 agreed at some point they should resolve the matter. But until the matter was resolved, the policy existed. For the policy was secrecy until changed. It was not openness until closed. One might look at that and say, well, FDR was hankering for a pattern of procrastination to which he was often inclined. And there might be some merit to that. But keep in mind that he had systematically affirmed and reaffirmed the policy of secrecy. And thus, in that context, when the Secretary of War said we should soon decide, the Secretary of War, as well as President Roosevelt, understood that secrecy would continue until it was overturned. And thus, in April 1945, when President Harry S. Truman unexpectedly was thrust into the presidency, he became the heir in a way he was to recognize within days, if not sooner, of a powerful and dual heritage involving the atomic bomb. That the bomb was a legitimate weapon to be used in war against a hated enemy. That the bomb did not raise about potential use moral or ethical issues. And linked to that was the other part of the heritage, the bomb as weapon and in the future could open a panoply of possibilities involving power. President Roosevelt, contrary to some analysts, was not, I think, naive about power, was not naive about military power, was not in unalloyed fashion optimistic about relations with the Soviet Union. I think he was hopeful about relations with the Soviet Union, but he also kept in reserve an ace, just in case. For FDR, this was a powerful position which he would have played out. How would he have played it out? Well, of course, we can only speculate on how he would have played it out. He died too soon. I suspect that had he lived, he might have handled the post-war issue of the bomb very differently. There is no reason compelling to believe that he would have handled the matter of using it any differently had he lived. And thus imagine the situation for President Harry S. Truman in April 1945. A man who didn't learn about the bomb project until he became president. Before that, as a high-ranking senator, he had known there was an expensive project which he'd been asked as a head of an investigating committee not to look into. Henry L. Stimson, a Republican, aged and respected, and General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff, respected and often revered, had each asked Truman not to look into this matter lest he dislocate things or pry open secrecy, and Truman had acceded. He discovered in the early hours, or maybe the early days of the project, Put yourself for a moment in the situation that a Harry S. Truman must have felt in 1945, suddenly becoming Mr. President. He knew so much about foreign policy at the time. He didn't know of the bomb project. He didn't know what had transpired at Yalta. He had to call somebody in who'd been to Yalta to tell him a version of what occurred. What problems did Harry S. Truman face in 1945? Well, all he had to do was end the war in Europe, which was predictably winding down, shape the peace on the continent, deal with the Soviet Union, end the war in the Pacific, deal with the matter of Asia and post-war Japan, reconvert the economy at home, avoid massive unemployment, and hope the depression of the 1930s would not recur. And ideally doing all that while getting elected in 48, maintaining the Democratic coalition, and making himself popular with the American people. If you have some sense of a burden as well as an opportunity, this was indeed the situation that Harry S. Truman faced in 1945. This was a man, and I do not think I either dramatize nor distort, who in the early days of his presidency, when he would be addressed as respectfully he was, as Mr. President, he would literally on some occasions spin around looking for FDR. FDR had been president during Harry S. Truman's entire national political career. Truman had known no other president while he was in Washington as a senator or briefly as a vice president. Periodically, he would say to people, sometimes seizing the bucolic image appropriate to a former, rather failed dirt farmer, guys, he would say, pray for me, I feel as if a bale of hay has fallen on me. Other times, seizing the kind of cosmic image, perhaps more appropriate to the presidency of the United States, he would say, pray for me, I feel as if the moon and the stars have fallen on me. The imagery, while variously picturesque, lame, or colloquial, depending upon your perspective, indicated a sense of being overwhelmed. It would have taken a rare individual, probably elected in his own right, or full of self-confidence, with different values, to receive the dual heritage bestowed upon him by Roosevelt and the assumptions and decisions passed on to Truman. It would have taken a rare individual to look at all that in April, May 1945, to define it closely, to assess it carefully, and to choose in some way to reformulate and even reverse. The Truman did not have that independence of mind. He sought, in some matters at least, to be loyal to the heritage. And more significantly, he had no inclination to reverse the heritage. So the weight of heritage, in many ways reinforcing inclination, brought to him if you will, a bond or nearly cemented belief in secrecy vis-a-vis the Soviets on the bomb and also in the legitimacy of the use of the weapon. It is in that context that I want to examine why the bomb was used. And I want to do something that will strike you as both historical and not. And that is, I want to look at a series of various possible ways, so-called alternatives to the use of the bomb. And I want to do two things in addressing those alternatives. One is, I want to ask, why was not that alternative pursued instead? That's a historical question. It can be answered, although, as you know from studying history, not everybody looking at the same evidence, no matter how fair-minded and smart, will come to the same decisions. Secondly, I want to ask a question that is historically informed, but where you might want to say the answer is not historically shaped. And that is, I want to ask the counterfactual. What would have happened if this alternative instead had been pursued? What would have happened? Or to put it more precisely, using the appropriate subjunctive, what might have happened? With that, I want to talk about the various possibilities, running through them. The one that is brooded about most often is the prospect of a non-combat demonstration or warning and non-combat demonstration. The prospect of a non-combat demonstration did come up twice. Once at a lunch meeting on May 31st for somewhere between about 5 and maybe as much as 10 minutes in a situation involving some scientists where there were also some policymakers present. And best we can piece it together from memoirs, there's no contemporary document on the subject. The matter was posed by maybe one or two scientists and dismissed speedily on the linked grounds that there was no guarantee, this was May 31st, the bomb would work. To announce or warn about a bomb that might not work could mean to embarrass the United States and possibly to embolden the Japanese if the project failed. Beyond that, if the bomb did work, an advanced warning followed by a non-combat demonstration against some part of Japan might mean the likelihood of Allied and especially American POWs moved into the area, and thus a weapon, if successful, might lead to the incineration of POWs. In that context, a decision was made quickly at a lunch and reaffirmed a few weeks later when there was slightly more attention, but hardly systematic attention, that this was not a viable, attractive alternative. Now remember, whenever one talks about alternatives and viability, there's always an implicit measure of whether you're seeking to avoid one thing and thus using what criteria you're using to choose alternatively. If, for example, the bomb had been presented, or if American leaders and advising scientists in May 1945 or June had seen the bomb as a terrible, evil weapon, then lots of risk might be incumbent to avoid it. But the bomb was seen, as American leaders and advising scientists saw it, as not evil, quite useful, possibly even attractive. Then the criterion implicitly to avoid the use becomes overwhelming. Unless you can guarantee the alternative is likely to be successful, any risk becomes too great and perhaps even unconscionable. It is in that context that it was very easy for advising scientists and for those policymakers who are attentive easily to dismiss this alternative as unattractive, as risky, and as dangerous. If you were to ask me retrospectively from what we know about Japanese decision-making in 1945 and how the war went, what was the likelihood that a non-combat demonstration would have produced a surrender? We better formulate the question more precisely. For the issue is not produce a surrender. Everybody in 1945, whether Japanese or American, in leadership circles, knew who was going to win that war and who was going to lose it. The question was not victory or defeat. The question was victory when, by what means, at what cost. Not whether there would be victory, but when there would be victory. The cost and the means. In that context, the likelihood of a non-combat demonstration producing a surrender before November 1st, I would say was probably somewhere about 5 or 10%. Don't take these numbers literally. Take them as suggestive, and let me explain why I'm giving numbers. If I used adverbs have the terrible liability of offering pungency without specificity most of the time. If I said, not very likely, some of you would hear not very likely as under 80%, and some of you would hear it as not over 0.5%. So the numbers are to give a false specificity to a general notion. And that's why I say about 5 or 10%. Don't take it literally, but take it suggestively. Why November 1st as a criterion that I imposed? because, as many of you know from your studies, the so-called small-scale invasion was scheduled for November 1st, 1945. Small scale, about 670,000 troops. By what use of the English language does that become small scale? Because if that did not produce a surrender by early 1946, there would be a large-scale invasion roughly in early March of 46. So small scale is comparative to large scale. What were the number of dead estimated? November 1st invasion, followed if need be by the fighting, followed by need be the large-scale invasion. Many of you have heard from various sources and read 1 million. You've read either casualties or fatalities, and in lay sources, including history books, very often these terms are conflated as if they have identical meaning. You, as already technical trained, know that there's a difference between a fatality and an injury. The difference often simply between life and death. The pre-Hiroshima estimates by advisory planning committees to the Joint Chiefs of Staff were somewhere between about 23,000 and about 46,000 American dead, depending upon where the invasion occurred, whether there were two invasions, how long the war lasted. Even taking these as rough numbers, they were presented at the time as rough numbers, if you do plus or minus 20%, you can say that the estimate was somewhere between about 20,000 and 60,000. It was not 500,000, it was not 1 million, it was not millions. Those are post-war creations or flawed recollections, and we can later in question and answer discuss which. So, the first so-called alternative was easily dismissed. There was no desire to take a risk, and my, at least retrospective and distant view, is that the chances of it having produced a surrender before November 1st would have been quite low, 5-10%. What about the second so-called possibility? That is of modifying explicitly the unconditional surrender formula and explicitly guaranteeing the continuation of the emperor. This matter did come up on a few occasions. Indeed, among others, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, by July, came to the conclusion that a guarantee of the emperor might well end the war earlier than otherwise. Placed in an early draft of the Potsdam Declaration, a paper that was issued on July 26, 1945, in an early draft was an explicit guarantee of the maintenance of the imperial system. That was removed on the feared grounds that a guarantee of the imperial system might well embolden the Japanese to anticipate future concessions, might prolong the war rather than shorten the war, and furthermore would produce a tremendous backlash in the United States. All of you, with the exception of the superintendent and some of the faculty and perhaps a few lay folks over there on my left, your right, are too young. You're all distantly prenatal during World War II. In World War II, Hirohito was normally presented by official propaganda and unofficial sources as virtually the twin of evil with Adolf Hitler. Most Americans wanted in the spring and summer of 1945 to see Hirohito not simply deposed, but tried as a war criminal. A guarantee pre-Japanese surrender by a new administration which had a short-run honeymoon with the Congress and the people of maintaining the imperial system would have risked a powerful domestic backlash in the United States. I'm not arguing that Truman and Burns, as Secretary of State, refused to do this simply for domestic politics. I think this is one of those cases where advice to them was that a concession might extend the war rather than shorten it. And if it failed, it would furthermore create terrible problems to the administration at home. And thus domestic and international factors came together in a reinforcing seamless web where there was no need for policymakers to say, is domestic 60% and international 40%? Or is international 75% and domestic 25%? When causes reinforce one another, generally, unless we're unusually reflective and given to excessive speculation, we don't ask why, we just move in the direction that the causes push. And thus, there was no desire by American leaders to take this risk. And they did not. In retrospect, I think we can say that it was probably a missed opportunity at about maybe 15% likelihood of success. Now, you could also say the likelihood was barely a missed opportunity. You can use either diction to refer to a 15% likelihood, but it's certainly not overwhelming. Moving from that, what about, I just realized that I had forgotten that I wanted to turn the blackboard, and thus I've been making an assumption which was quite unwarranted. These are the alternatives. The third possibility linked to the second was pursuing Japanese peace feelers. Indeed, Japanese peace feelers were not pursued because, by and large, they were vague. Picking them out later on, you can find some that look very specific. But the mosaic of generality, where some days they would say guarantee the emperor, some days they would say guarantee the emperor, allow post-war self-disarmament, the Japanese maintain their own war criminal trials, and also perhaps even keeping some of the territories gained in World War II. In generality, as American leaders looked at these peace feelers, the likelihood of surrender was so low that American leaders felt no desire to pursue the matter. What's the likelihood that the peace feelers, if pursued, would have yielded success? Maybe 10, 15%, not much more, certainly. What about the prospect of awaiting Soviet entry into the war? After the fact, we know that Soviet entry did play an important part in catapulting the Japanese to surrender. Before the end of the war, it was not generally clear to American leaders that Soviet entry into the war was likely to have such a role. And furthermore, at least one hoped to forestall Soviet entry lest the Soviets grab pieces of the mainland. The Soviets, in turn, after the first bomb and before the second, moved up their schedule from August 15th to August 8th to enter the war. In retrospect, I think we can say that Soviet entry without the bomb had probably a likelihood of about 25, 30% of producing a surrender without the bomb and before November 1st. It was not a majority missed opportunity, but it may have been in some fashion a missed opportunity, but certainly not overwhelming, and not foreseen generally in advance. What about so-called conventional war? That is, stepping up heavy bombing of Japanese cities and maintaining the blockade. There's no question that these mechanisms would have produced a surrender. The question is, would they produce a surrender before November 1st? But let me step back for a moment and ask you to reflect. When we ask these questions, we ask them not simply because we want to understand why decisions were made, but sometimes we have a sense of rural lament about the past. Is it clearly the case that conventional bombing was morally, at that time, so distinguishable from the atomic bomb? After the fact, many of us viscerally feel there's a difference. But could people in 45 reasonably conclude there was a moral difference? And what did it inhere? that lots of planes and lots of bombs killing lots of people are somehow not as troubling as one bomb, one plane killing lots of people? It's hard, I suggest, especially in the framework of 45, to formulate a moral distinction that allows you to parse out why one would be acceptable and the other not. After the fact, you might want to say that the main difference is genetic damage to the unborn, not foreseen at the time, although it should have been. Or you may want to say that a sword of Damocles, metaphorically, was to hang over 2 generations, and the real difference was beyond 45, and there the moral difference lies. But why wasn't conventional bombing? It wasn't pursued instead, it was pursued in addition. For American leaders, bombing conventionally and bombing with the atomic bomb were both acceptable forms of action. The quotation with which I began, to dramatize the mass death, where I carefully phrase matters, is a quotation not describing Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It's describing Tokyo and the mass bombing of March 10, 1945. Yes, I think this might well have 25% or so produce a surrender before November 1st. The reciprocal, 75% or so that it would not have. But it is quite likely that some combination, guaranteeing the emperor, awaiting Soviet entry into the war, mass bombing and blockade, the combination having more than an additive conclusion, but having a synergistic conclusion exceeding its additive value, would have produced a surrender before November 1st. But to say after the fact it might have had that effect, or probably would have had that effect, is quite distinguishable from American leaders pre-Hiroshima being able to predict with total assurance it would have that effect. Thus, why were the bombs used? Because from the beginning there was an assumption they would be used. It was built in the framework, the fabric, the inheritance, the leaders, the advisors, and unchallenged by anybody in Washington in or near leadership circles. There is no single person pre-Hiroshima who opposed the potential, nobody in Washington in leadership circles who pre-Hiroshima opposed the prospective use of nuclear weapons. Beyond some after the fact recollected things they had perhaps thought but never uttered pre-Hiroshima and probably did not even think. Beyond that, and significantly, American leaders and the public, by and large, have become inured to the mass killing of civilians. For the real question is not why the bombs were used. The real question is, why were the bombs used on cities filled with non-combatants? And the answer after Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo and Nagoya and Osaka and 20 or 30 other Japanese cities is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki in prospect did not raise, for military leaders, for civilian leaders, and for the combination, any profoundly distinctive moral issues. By then, killing was acceptable, killing massively was acceptable, killing non-combatants was generally acceptable. The American public welcomed it, and most leaders comfortably endorsed it. By then, by 1945, there was this general inuring to mass killing. Beyond that, there may have been some desire, not as a propelling reason, but a reinforcing reason for revenge after Pearl Harbor and the treatment of Allied POWs. There may even have been some theme among policymakers of racism. But do not misunderstand me. I fully believe had the bomb been ready a year earlier or 8 months earlier, it would have been used against Germany. It may simply have been easier for American policymakers to use it against Japan, but it did not make a distinctive difference. Beyond that, I do think that American leaders also believed that the bomb would have the benefit of intimidating the Soviet Union. But let me be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not. I am not arguing that American leaders used the bomb primarily to intimidate the Soviet Union. or that that was a propelling reason. I think that was a bonus that reinforced an act that would have occurred if there literally had been no Soviet Union, if it had been either the Commonwealth or the old Tsarist nation. It made an easy act more attractive, but did not make a critical difference. And thus I would say that inheritance and momentum in earlier decisions explain the use of the bomb, and on cities, the progressive inuring to mass killing. That these are supplementary themes that reinforce, but did not in any way make the critical difference. What then does the use of the bombs mean in 1945? I think what the use means is that by 1945, all great civilized nations were willing to use almost all weapons, gas perhaps exempted, biological warfare more likely to be exempted, against hated enemies, and enemies were by nature defined hated. In 1945, what rendered the United States unique was that it alone had the bomb. And that inheres exceptionalism of industry, of prowess, of science, of resources, that any nation in 1945 that had the bomb would have used it. And thus, in an ironic way, for those who would believe in American exceptionalism, whether guilt or virtue, I do not think you can find in the bomb acts any great distinctiveness, except, if you will, in the fact of implementation, which was easily accommodated by the fact of possession. Stalin privately welcomed their use. Churchill enthusiastically in advance endorsed their use. It is impossible for me to believe the Germans, Japanese, Italians, French, or other folk, civilized people, and there'd be some irony there, so hear it, that civilized people would have eschewed the opportunity against a hated enemy to use such a powerful weapon. And thus the bomb was used. It was used easily. It was used twice. Whatever one may conclude about the necessity of Hiroshima, most likely, best one can determine this, Nagasaki was unnecessary. None foresaw it. Remained for historians later to argue it. And thus, these acts of near cosmic significance in 1945 represented in a strange way not a decision, but an implementation of an assumption. Not a matter that raised the kinds of ethical issues that we raise in scrutiny, but rather effortless and casual acceptance of what seemed justifiable and conscionable. But to remind you, in that we analyze America, in that we analyze the Western world, in that we analyze modern civilization in 1945. For no nation, I would say, unfortunately, no nation would have done otherwise. And that, I think, is a story of the implementation of an assumption begun under FDR, inherited by Truman, and thus I would offer that as the analysis as to why the United States in 1945 dropped atomic bombs. For those of you who would like to believe in uniqueness, it erodes it. For those of you who would like to believe in exceptionalism, it undermines it. For those of you who would like to look at 1945 as a watershed of humankind, recognizing a certain commonality, it may, fortunately or not, so affirm it. Let me end on that note, intentionally ambivalent. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bernstein. We have time for just a couple of questions. Number two.
Sir, Cadet Hogan. So I was just wondering, you based it mainly, the decision to drop the bomb, you rotated around Truman, but there was the interim committee and all that. I was wondering, who do you think were the major actors? I know Leo Slezard and all them, all the scientists had some input into this. I was wondering, how much of an effect do you think that they had, and other than just the national leaders, what other actors do you think took part in this decision-making process?
Well, as we know, some of the scientists, exclusively at Chicago, Leo Szilard, James Franck, Thorfinn Hagnes, Glenn Seaborg, and Joyce Stearns and two others whose names I've now forgotten, 7 members signed the so-called Franck Report, which argued for a non-combat demonstration instead. If you read it carefully, what they argued is that the use of the bomb without prior warning to the Soviets will produce and unleash a post-war arms race. Their secondary argument was, let's not use the bomb, the implication of saving lives. That report had no effect for 2 sets of linked reasons. One is it went to the scientific advisory panel of Oppenheimer, Fermi, Compton, and Ernest O. Lawrence on a weekend in mid-June 1945, when they were doing more important things, as Oppenheimer was to report 7 or 9 years later. The decision was by then virtually made. The leading scientists, Lawrence, Oppenheimer, Fermi, Compton, had already accommodated and in many ways supported it. It was too late for dissent to puncture consensus, and those who were dissenting were not especially powerful or notable. Had the Oppenheimer group of 4 said to Washington, my God, the Franck Committee has persuaded us. This is immoral, this is wretched, this is terrible, the chances are it would have had no effect. For the decision to use the bomb was not a decision vested in scientists. They had no unique capacity in the judgment of policymakers in Washington, and very little access to giving effective counsel. By then, the entire system had moved from the beginning to accept, to reinforce, and subtly to reinforce repeatedly this decision. Thus, if you were to ask even, when was the decision made? We know when the order was signed, but the decision preceded the order. The decision, in a sense, was always made and never specifically made. Let me give you a rough analogy. Beyond your summer preceding academic classes at the academy, when you tried to decide whether to stay or not, you were making decisions daily in many cases. For those of you who are plebes, how many in the last week or 2 have made the decision self-consciously to stay? By and large, your decisions have been made before. It would be hard for most of you to remember what day you made it, for its real making was followed by subtle reinforcement. If not, it was made the opposite way. In many ways, the bomb is like the latter stages of your plebe experience. And unlike the initial stages, there was a decision assumed, affirmed, and yet never explicitly made, but always understood and easily implemented. It would have been very hard for anyone outside the edifice of assumption to raise issues that would have punctured consensus. And significantly, no leader, including a number of military leaders who post-Hiroshima, in memoirs most often written by others for them, who claimed pre-Hiroshima doubts, ever uttered to the president or anyone else those doubts. There is no contemporary pre-Hiroshima document by Leahy, Eisenhower, Arnold, LeMay raising a question about the use of the bomb. Afterward, a lot of them, and I mean not to offend, but rather to dramatize with the colloquial, a lot of them, quote, got religion. But it was a rather belated conversion after at least an Armageddon visited upon others, to sustain the imagery. a lengthy answer, but I welcome the opportunity to go beyond even what you asked to address things that I couldn't compress into my 42 and a half or 43 minutes, which ran to 46 and a half. It's called a kind of encroachment.
Number one. Sir, Cadet Fletcher, Company Bravo 4. Sir, my question is, you gave us the number one and number two reasons of why the bomb was used here in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sir, I was wondering if you could give us a number one and number two reason of why the bomb was not used during the Korean War.
Certainly. There were two linked reasons. The most powerful was that during the Korean War, had the United States used the bomb, in any situation, it would have destroyed the NATO alliance almost immediately. Beyond that, with the exception of about 2 months during the Korean War, a majority of American sentiment, as well as we can measure these things by public opinion polls, opposed the use of the bomb. On those 2 or 3 months of exceptions, where a majority of those with attitudes favored the use of the bomb, the chances are that the opposition was more deeply felt than the support for it in America. And in general, a president cannot safely, in a democratic polity where he wants, among other things, to be elected, take a dramatic step involving any kind of mass killing or dramatic commitment where even 35 or 40% of the electorate staunchly opposes. Thus, I would say in conclusion, primarily foreign policy reasons, secondarily domestic for the most part, and I would go so far as to argue that the United States entered the Korean War primarily to save Europe, seeing this as the first of a series of Soviet incursions, and secondarily to save Asia. Having gone to war to save Europe, to use a weapon that would lose, quote unquote, Europe would have been, to use that terrible phrase, counterproductive. And for those reasons, I think the bomb was not used, although it was considered at the time of the chosen reservoir, December 1950, and it was also considered, we now know, seriously in the spring of 1951. In neither case could a president have safely, for international reasons primarily, domestic reasons secondarily, used the atomic bomb.
Thank you, Professor Bernstein. That's all the time we have. We do have a presentation to make.
Professor Bernstein, on behalf of the United States Corps of Cadets and the West Point community, I'd like to present this gift to you as a token of appreciation for your thoughtful comments here tonight, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being an attentive, and I'm sure, well, from the questions, I'm sure knowledgeable audience, since I don't think the questions were planted. I regret that we don't have more time, but I understand the constraints of military life, and also that after an extended weekend, and after, for many of you, dinner, the desire to get back to barracks and do all those things which you should be doing. Some of us would like to believe that's primarily studying, and I'll continue earnest optimism even in the face of potential countervailing evidence. Thank you.
All first-class cadets with privileges and members of the West Point community are invited to a reception for Professor Bernstein immediately following in the Rose Room of the Officers Club. Corps is dismissed.